When we bite into food, this is where our incisors are very important. This is something we do every day without thinking about it, and yet very few people know how it really works. The term incisor in itself is ultimately misleading and only partially correct. Our anterior teeth cut into our food, it's true, but then we tear off the food with our hands. We don't bite it off. Our teeth don't come into contact with one another in the process. We use our anterior teeth mainly to grip our food with in this process. If what we're eating is tougher, we bite it off using our more stable canine teeth and our first premolars. Once again though, we bite into our food first, then tear it off by hand. Again, there's no contact between the teeth here. When looking at chewing, the first thing which interests us is whether we do this consciously or unconsciously. When we start chewing, the cortex or cerebral cortex sends a conscious voluntary cortical pulse which initiates the chewing process. As we keep chewing, this then becomes a subcortical process, that is, subconscious, controlled by our central nervous system. These reflective movements are controlled by our brainstem or medulla oblongata. As our teeth come into contact with our food, or just before that, there's an innervation pause of around 120 to 190 milliseconds of the closing muscles, while the opening muscles are excited at more or less the same time. This prevents the teeth coming into contact with one another when we chew. If they do come into contact, this is only very briefly, for around 100 milliseconds. The closing phases of all chewing cycles end at the physiological centric position of our chewing system. This is where the lower jaw comes into contact with the upper jaw, which is the same as the habitual intercuspidation position, that is, the usual closing position. This takes place within a working area of approximately 1 millimeter. What about the food though? What happens to it when we chew? Once our anterior teeth have bitten off as much as we can chew, our posterior teeth come into play, that is, our premolars and molars. If we look closer at what happens to our food, we find that the two cusps act basically like a hose conveying food along our teeth. While we're chewing on the working side of our mouth, the chime, which has been mashed up and enriched with saliva, is carried along this so-called chewing line. This area is defined at top and bottom by the chewing areas of the posterior teeth and at the sides by our cheeks and tongues. With their working and shear cusps, the shape of our posterior teeth thus form a perfect morphological unit for shearing and crushing our food, and then containing and conveying the chime in the chewing line. Non-working cusps are found buccally in the upper jaw and lingually in the lower. They shear food off. Normally, they have little or no points of contact in the occlusion. The principle of freedom of non-working cusps is extremely important. This mashes and shears the food into an increasingly fine chime. This process comes into play in the final millimeters before reaching the centric. The food is crushed between the teeth. This is where the working cusps come in, on the inside of the upper jaw and the outside of the lower jaw. In the occlusal contact position, it's these cusps where we find most contact points. Even when the food is crushed completely, the antagonists do not usually meet. Our teeth retain their morphology well into old age, as they do not come into contact with one another when we chew. Our teeth are also involved when we speak. If our teeth change, especially our anterior teeth, we also change how we speak. Certain jaw and teeth positions govern the phonetics of our language. The teeth do not come into contact with one another when we actually speak.
A,
B,
C,
D,
E, F.
When we say an F, our anterior teeth touch the transition between the wet lip and dry lip areas of our lower lip.
J,
K,
The closest the antagonists come together is when we make an S sound, when they are 1 to 2 millimeters apart.
T,
Even then, however, the teeth are not in contact with one another. Teeth and aesthetics. We use our teeth to give certain gestures more emphasis. How we position our teeth and jaws relative to one another backs up our body language and conveys feelings such as rage, distaste, satisfaction, or even pleasure. There are a number of laws which govern our teeth and our faces too. No one's face is completely symmetrical. The two halves of our faces are slightly different. It follows that our natural dentition is not entirely symmetrical either. While nature strives for symmetry to achieve harmony, it varies from it slightly. Anything which is completely symmetrical looks boring and lifeless. A certain amount of asymmetry seems to be essential to good aesthetics. Everyone looks different. Our faces are unique, making us individual and helping others recognize us. What's always impressive is how varied nature is. Criteria such as what shape our head is and how far apart our eyes and mouth are of great importance here. The same applies to our teeth. Every one of us has teeth which are as unique as our fingerprints. Whether we see our teeth as pleasant depends on where their center is, how they're shaped, and how far apart they are. We usually see departures from this as unattractive and unaesthetic. The fact that we can apply these laws to our heads as well as our teeth is probably not a coincidence. And Williams' research has shown that the shape of our heads and the shape of our teeth are related directly to one another. People with round heads tend to have more rounded anterior teeth, of course. As well as round heads, there are also triangular, square and rectangular heads, which in turn indicates how their anterior teeth will look too.